What's up, everybody? This is Joe Mullinax, and on this edition of Locked On Grizzlies, we are talking Ja Morant being back out from the shadows, out of the dark, and into the light, so to speak. We're talking Jaren Jackson Jr. at 24 years old, how excited you should be, and how it should match my excitement. And we're also going to preview our next episode of Locked On Grizzlies when DeMichael Cole rejoins me, taking a look at a question that's pretty significant for the Memphis Grizzlies heading into this coming season. All that and more on this edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So good to be back with you on Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host for this episode of the show, Joe Mullinax, still flying solo. DeMichael Cole will be back with us on tomorrow's episode. Yes, you heard that right. Tomorrow's episode of the show as we get back into being your team and your show each and every day following the Memphis Grizzlies. We're excited about that transition as the season is inching ever so close. You can taste it, you can feel it, you can smell it. Basketball is almost upon us. Again, we are proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day as we transition back to being an everyday show. Free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can also check us out on YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, all of those fun things. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. An interesting weekend when it comes to Memphis Grizzlies ideas and thought processes. Again, as things get bubbling and churning, moving around once again, FIBA ends, and all eyes of the basketball world start to transition to the coming NBA season. Obviously, the WNBA playoffs are going on, and those are fascinating in their own right. This is Locked On Grizzlies, and looking at what this team will be without Ja Morant is difficult when Ja Morant is actively out in the public spotlight again, which he had done over the past weekend. Which I'm not trying to say that Ja Morant needs to kind of punish himself and not be out in the public eye. And to be honest with you, excuse me, given the event that he was appearing at, it may not have been an option. It might have been more of a contractual obligation because Ja Morant, again, out in the limelight, doesn't get much brighter this time of year for basketball than the Nike World Basketball Festival in New York. And he was one of the coaches for a game, an exhibition that occurred there in New York City. It was Ja Morant, Victor Wembanyama against Kevin Durant and Devin Booker. So some of the biggest names in basketball right now, obviously Wembanyama going to be a rookie, but one of the most highly touted and heralded rookies since LeBron James. Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, very clearly important pieces of the Nike regime, and with the Phoenix Suns, championship contenders, at least theoretically speaking. And then you have Ja Morant. One of these things is not like the other when it comes to potentially being in trouble with the National Basketball Association. Now, you could obviously argue that that trouble has come and gone and the suspension's being served, and maybe Nike is going to be happy with that. I would hope that Nike is going to be happy with that. And I want to stress something here as well. Obviously, leading off with Ja Morant, poking his head back out in public, being a part of a major event like that, we have to address it. This is more DeMichael Cole, my co-host's forte, right? Beat writer covering the Memphis Grizzlies for the Commercial Appeal, does a phenomenal job. He is much more in tune with the sneaker culture, much more in tune with how Nike's inner operations work and how they view what's going on with Ja. So this is probably a topic we'll bring up again on tomorrow's show, at least briefly, to get DeMichael's take on how the event went down, the significance of Ja being there. For me, it's about him being out in the open, right? He's not a pariah, especially when it comes to Nike, the biggest single sponsor that he has, the one with the most direct line, if he's able to turn things around to that generational wealth. You know, DeMichael and I have talked about he and his mom's stated goal is to be a billionaire, for him to be a billionaire. That's a great goal. Don't get me wrong, but you have to, be able to play basketball for a sustained period of time in order to pull that off. And Ja, obviously, not really at that space in that place at this moment. Now, as DeMichael has talked about, and I have also talked about it, hasn't really impacted the sales of his shoe. Maybe it's impacted the distribution of his shoe. Maybe it has changed how certain shoes are getting dropped or released or whatever the vernacular might be. Maybe, again, the process has shifted. But obviously, Ja is still part of Nike's plans. Otherwise, Ja would not have been at this event. There are plenty of other Nike athletes that could have taken Ja Morant's place, and yet Ja was there as a representative of one of the top names of the Nike brand. Could this be a step in healing? Could this be a part of the process, not just for Nike reintroducing Ja as a face of the brand, but also maybe going more full scale with his shoe with the NBA basketball season approaching, obviously in the next month or two? High school, college basketball gets started. As all that comes into view, is this Nike starting to ramp up the Ja Morant hype train again? It's going to be difficult to do that with Morant not playing until December. And again, the behavior that has put Ja in this position is not necessarily something that you want your 8-year-old to emulate as you go and buy them Ja ones. But if that's not a concern, and I think early returns, as we've seen, and DeMichael has talked about this, when the shoes have been released, it's not like people are refusing to buy them, right? They're flying off the shelves. He is still very much an in-demand face brand in and of himself. The issues off the court are significant, and they should not be belittled or thought of as something that doesn't matter. But at the same time, if it makes dollars, it makes sense. And I think Nike has plenty at this stage of data to be able to say, this is not hurting him in terms of his allure to young people in particular, how he is perceived by them. He is still very much in line to perhaps be the heir apparent when Kevin Durant and LeBron James and these other Nike type names have stepped aside over these next few years. Ja, right there with Victor Wembanyama. Obviously, Devin Booker will still be around too. But if you're comparing Ja Morant and Devin Booker, Ja Morant is the guy in terms of maybe not basketball at the moment. If you want to argue that Devin Booker is better than Ja Morant, I don't know. A ton of people will disagree with you. Some may, especially ones that live in Memphis, Tennessee. But you have to keep the perspective of this being a business venture, right? Ja is not just a basketball player in the eyes of Nike. He is an extension of their brand. He is damaged. There's no denying that. There is clear evidence to suggest that they acknowledge that, at least to an extent. They haven't completely removed his shoe. They haven't completely shut down their relationship with Morant like they've done with Kyrie Irving and other people in the past. They're waiting this out. And to this point, they look smart for doing so because it has not directly shifted or changed large-scale public perception. Are there people that think Ja Morant is spoiled, people that think that Ja is ignorant, making poor decisions? However you want to phrase it, I'm sure there are those folks out there. And if you listen to Locked On Grizzlies, if you follow my work over at Bluff City Media, I agree with most of that. There's a lot of growth that has to come from Ja, and it has to be something he wants to do. It can't be forced from the outside. Otherwise, nothing's ever going to change with him. But the NBA is a business venture, just like Nike is a business partner. And Ja Morant continues to drive business. If he didn't, he would not have been at this event. So obviously, there wasn't a ton of television cameras. It's not like something that is going to be on a television partner like ABC, ESPN. Obviously, that probably plays a hand in this. But I do believe that him being there is a sign that it's full steam ahead, assuming that Ja does what he has to do and holds up his end of the bargain in terms of his growth, not just as a basketball player, because that's the least of the concerns at this moment, right? He just needs to be able to stay on the floor because he's representing himself in the Memphis Grizzlies in the organization that is the National Basketball Association. Well, Nike is a pretty important extension of that. And so far, Nike seems to believe, or at least enough to not hurt their economic prowess any more so than they already have with limited releasing of the Nike shoe. Maybe things will start picking back up again here soon. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we are going to talk Jaren Jackson Jr., recently turned 24 years old, kind of rehashing of what we saw in FIBA. Not much you can take from that when it comes to the Grizzlies, because obviously Jaren is not going to be a center for Memphis, at least not as a starter. But what do you get from Jaren? How do you see his ceiling? Is all NBA in the future? How is that relevant to an upcoming contract extension? We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. Snap into action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, yes, right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That is $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is extremely easy to use, and there's a wide range of betting options available to you, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL, or an official partner of the NFL. When we come back, we will be talking Jaren Jackson Jr. and perhaps his odds at making a lot more money than he currently is as the NBA season approaches. We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax. I am your host for this episode, this first episode of us being back in your daily podcast queue. I hope you're as excited for that as I am. That means the season is approaching. DeMichael Cole will be back with me on our next edition of the show. And I do think that obviously John Morant will be a constant topic of conversation. So will Jaren Jackson Jr., but allow for this episode to maybe serve as a preview of tomorrow's episode too, because there's a lot of topics on this show that I think are going to be good to talk with DeMichael about. And the John Morant stuff from the shoe angle, that's pretty significant. But how he sees Jaren, who just recently turned 24, people forget that. Jaren Jackson Jr. is younger than John Morant, which is pretty wild to say out loud. It's not, a massive difference. Jaren was born September 15th, so this past weekend. Happy birthday to Jaren this past Friday. Ja turned 24 last month in August, but Ja, even though he's a year behind in the NBA from Jaren, is roughly the same age as Jaren Jackson Jr. So Jaren's been in the league a year longer. Jaren is currently on a $100 million contract that's descending in value. So he made the most money in year one. He's entering year 3 of that extension. And the contract stuff is significant because Bobby Marks of ESPN recently put out various benchmarks and things that need to happen for Supermax deals in the future, right? The type of contract that John Morant was eligible to sign, didn't make all NBA the second year, and missed out on, roughly $60 million or so because of it. Jaren, with his Defensive Player of the Year award, is approaching a similar possibility. And being a repeat Defensive Player of the Year could help him along that way. Making the All-NBA team could also help him in that pursuit. This will be the first year of the All-NBA team being positionless. So that should take care of, centers versus centers and power forwards, how many minutes they log in any certain specific position. If Jaren's one of the best 15 players in the NBA this coming year and he makes All-NBA, that will make him eligible for a Supermax contract the next time extension talks get underway with him again. He's entering year 3 of his current 4-year contract. So it'd be next summer that an extension could be discussed potentially. Jaren Jackson Jr., how he approaches this pretty significant year, right? Again, just turned 24. It's almost like a junior year in high school. Right, it's almost like a junior year in college if you're somebody who decided to stay in the college ranks and you're trying to move up the draft board. Professionally, this is as close to that as he's going to get because now he's looking at an opportunity to make Ja Morant, Desmond Bane money, right? Because Jaren is now the 3rd highest paid player after the Bane extension kicks in. Jaren will be in year 4 while Bane is in year 1 of his extension. Ja will be in year 2 of his. And Jaren Jackson Jr. is going to be the 3rd highest paid player on the Grizzlies. It's possible that changes, of course. How he approaches this season and the massive opportunity in front of him with Ja Morant not being on the floor. Obviously, Jaren wants Ja out there because that helps them win. And winning is a focus of his. He's making plenty of money, but you only have such a wide window, right? You only have so much time to make phenomenal amounts of money. And Jaren has won the genetic lottery in terms of being 6'11", 245 pounds. Now, I believe Jaren loves basketball. He works his tail off. Usually, if you're playing FIBA and doing international competition, you're not doing that because you hate your job, so to speak. But we were talking about this on social media recently. One of the biggest shocks to my system as I became someone that covered the NBA, technically I'm entering goodness, season 11 of me covering the Memphis Grizzlies as a media member, whatever the heck I am. That one of the biggest shocks is I interacted, limited interactions around NBA players and talked with reporters more so than the players themselves, is how a lot of these guys just don't like basketball. And it makes sense when you look at it from the sense of them being human, right? Lots of humans that aren't professional athletes don't like their jobs. There are NBA players that don't like their job. They don't like playing basketball. They'd much rather be doing something else. But because they have the chance to make this kind of money, and because they're 6'8", 6'4", with the electric athleticism and leapability and all the different things that make a basketball player elite at the NBA level, they play. That is, it makes sense, but it doesn't, at least for me. And I can only speak to my experience. Maybe in the comments, you can talk about yours and how you perceive how NBA players interact with that reality. I don't think Jaren is one of those guys, but the point I'm trying to make is they are very on to the fact that at some point, people aren't going to be willing to pay them millions of dollars to play in the NBA anymore. So when Jaren's money is up, here is a chance for him to maximize that investment. And no disrespect to who we talked about earlier in the show, Ja Morant, but Jaren Jackson Jr. is a little more mature than Ja is at this stage of the game, even though they're both the same age. Jaren Jackson Jr. is 24, looks a heck of a lot different than Ja Morant's 24. Ja Morant is not eligible to start the season with his teammates because of poor decisions he's made off the field. Jaren Jackson Jr. took his summer, played FIBA basketball, maybe was not as successful in that endeavor as others would have wanted him to be. And while I hoped that he would have success as a starting five, I'm not surprised that he didn't. And thankfully, the Memphis Grizzlies shouldn't care beyond having evidence. There's that key word of the show, evidence, that Jaren's not ready to do that just yet. Thank goodness, because they got Steven Adams, and he's on the team the next couple of years at least. Unless they trade him or something like that. Health assumed, Steve-O's not going anywhere. That is a good thing for Jaren. He's going to be put in a better position to be successful with the Grizzlies than he was with Team USA. Oh, and by the way, with Ja Morant out, it's going to be him and Desmond Bane carrying the burden of the offense's production. So he can show that he could be a go-to scorer, that he could be a main option on a team that is trying to compete for playoffs. That is the expectation for the Memphis Grizzlies now. They've been the number 2 seed in the Western Conference the last 2 years. So while falling down the Western Conference standings perhaps wouldn't be a surprise, given the current state of affairs for the Grizzlies, they're not going to fall that far. People that have them in the play-in, 8th, 9th, 10th, get out of here. There's no way that occurs as long as health is even across the board. The Grizzlies will be a top 5 team in the Western Conference, and they'll especially take off once Ja Morant returns, assuming he's able to join the team early and practice like DeMichael has talked about on previous episodes of Locked On Grizzlies, like they've done, the NBA has done for other similar suspensions. Jaren has the world at his feet. Here it is. Here's your moment. Here's your chance to show that you could be the third max guy on the Memphis Grizzlies. That makes things challenging for Zach Kleiman, GM of the Grizzlies and company, figuring out how to make the salary cap work, hoping and praying that when the next TV deal comes up, you're in a spot where that cap explodes and that Jaren extension is not going to look bad. You're not trading Jaren Jackson Jr. You're not letting him walk. You're going to have to pony up that dough. How much of it they put on the table is up to Jaren Jackson Jr. And Jaren has the opportunity of a lifetime. John Morant's mistakes could be silver linings in Jaren Jackson Jr.'s checkbook. He can show that he can be an all-NBA player. And if he is an all-NBA player, he'll be super max eligible, and he will very much be on that Grizzlies ledger, similar to Morant and Bane. It probably is anyway, but that number can go up with a massive monster Jaren Jackson Jr. season. So we'll take a look at props and awards and all those sorts of things coming up here with FanDuel in the coming weeks. Jaren being an all-NBA player is one I would keep an eye on. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, again, a topic that I'm going to broach with my partner, DeMichael Cole, on tomorrow's show, but I do want to preview it now. Who has more pressure on them? Two guys that also had recent birthdays. Zaire Williams or Taylor Jenkins entering the 2023-2024 NBA season. I'll preview that topic, which will be more openly discussed with DeMichael next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, flying solo once again. DeMichael and I will be back together on tomorrow's show. Again, yes, that is the big piece of news from this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Starting today, we are back almost 5 days a week. Not going to guarantee 5 days a week. Life happens, but 4 to 5 days a week, your show, your place to be each and every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network. You can count on me, you can count on DeMichael, you can count on us here at Locked On Grizzlies as we get closer to the season beginning. Jaren Jackson Jr., John Morant, the guys that we've been talking about throughout this episode, they're the guys that stir the drink, right? Without them, nothing else much matters. If those guys don't play, the Grizzlies don't have much of a shot. The two names we're about to discuss, and again, we're going to go more in depth with on tomorrow's episode because I really want to hear DeMichael's take on this. I think this is a good question. One of them seems like they should be more significant, and I think that that's probably the correct answer. It depends on how I frame the question. And again, with DeMichael, maybe the conversation morphs and evolves. I'm curious as to who you, again, maybe you can comment on this, and we'll continue this chat tomorrow as well. Who has more pressure on them going into this NBA season, Taylor Jenkins or Zaire Williams? And I bring up those two names together because they share a birthday, which is ironic, right? This is kind of a birthday-themed episode of Locked On Grizzlies. But Zaire Williams, September 12th, last week, had his birthday. Taylor Jenkins, right in that same window of time, different years, of course, where Coach Jenkins had his birthday. Both of them have pressure. Both of them have expectations on their heads. I think the expectations are greater for Taylor Jenkins because he's currently entering that Mark Jackson territory like Mark Jackson was for Golden State, where are you the guy before the guy? I don't know if that's entirely fair. And again, I really want to get to Michael's input on that. So I'm going to, this will probably be the main focus of tomorrow's episode. But I do think that it's fair to ask the question at least, because you're in a spot with a team that has been the number 2 seed, as I mentioned earlier in the show, for 2 straight years. And for the first time, you're dealing with regression, at least regression in terms of the end of the season. 2 years ago, you finished in the second round. You had been progressing each year of the Jenkins tenure, which lines up with the John Morant era. Boom, 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 from the play-in game to the play-in tournament winner and losing to the Utah Jazz to winning a first-round series. Everything was moving forward the way that you would hope and expect. And then last year, they got kicked in the face a little bit, right? The old Mike Tyson adage, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. Well, the Grizzlies have been punched in the mouth, both in terms of testing that progress isn't always linear theory that we always talk about here, but also in terms of losing Steven Adams, losing Brandon Clark. Injuries bit them. Saying that Luke Kennard was vital to their postseason success probably tells you all you need to know about how fragile the Memphis Grizzlies were when the season ended in Los Angeles at the hands of the Lakers last year. So how Jenkins responds to that, I think is significant. I don't think with John Morant being suspended, if the Grizzlies start 6-12, that they're going to fire Taylor Jenkins. But I do think that if there isn't noted improvement, if there isn't adjustment, if there isn't continued progression, even if it doesn't necessarily mean a Western Conference Finals appearance. But if they don't look like they're back on track, and Marcus Smart's arrival is indicative of that. Now is the time to win. That was a win-now trade. The first time in this era. That puts pressure on Jenkins. And to a lesser extent, and again, I'm going to do my best to be disciplined because I want to get to Michael's take on this tomorrow, Ziaire Williams has pressure. Where does Ziaire Williams fit on this team moving forward? He has other guys that have been brought in to replace him or at least compete with him in David Roddy and Jake LaRavia. If Ziaire cannot fit the model of what this team wants or needs, if he can't be that corner three-point specialist, or at least hit them at a high enough rate that he has to be respected, if he can't be a 6'9" true perimeter player that can defend different wings and deflect shots and be that stocks number builder that the Grizzlies clearly value, is he a lottery pick that flames out in Memphis? The latest in a long line. I've been patient with Ziaire. If you followed the show, followed my work at Bluff City Media, you know that to be true. But last year, around this time, DeMichael and I were talking about how they were betting on Ziaire Williams. He was going to be the sixth man. If he was able to work out, watch out, the Grizzlies were going to go to the moon. For a variety of reasons, maybe not entirely his fault, including his health, Ziaire was not able to be that guy. Now it's time to start thinking extensions for Ziaire. Money's about to get tight. We just mentioned with Jaren Jackson Jr. Even if he doesn't make the Supermax, he's still going to get a max. Defensive Player of the Year, that guy's not taking a pay cut again. You're going to pay full freight this time around, and you're going to have three dudes on max contracts. I believe Robert Pera and the Grizzlies front office when they say they'll pay the luxury tax to keep this team together, to keep the core three together. I highly doubt they'll do it consecutive years, and that means the pieces around Ja, Dez, and Jaren are going to continuously change. If Ziaire is not seen as a piece that can be part of that process, he won't be here. They will trade him, or they will find another way to move along from Ziaire to and really prioritize finding a piece that can be that wing for them. Even if it's not a star-level player, if they bet on Jaren and John Dez as those guys, they need someone that produces more than Ziaire has to this point. He has all the potential in the world. Can he realize it? That's pressure. So again, Ziaire, Taylor Jenkins, that's a really significant question to me. One of the main storylines of this season for me going into the season is how those two guys handle the pressure of expectation, whether it is continued and improved postseason success from Taylor Jenkins or just being a functional enough rotation player that you can validate and accept a Ziaire Williams extension. Because right now, I don't know that you can. And that's important, and that's a problem that the Grizzlies are going to have to address if it comes to that. Because Ziaire is a lottery talent. They took a bet. We can debate whether or not they wanted Ziaire. Maybe they wanted a Wagner or somebody else, but they got Ziaire. Could have had Trey Murphy. What comes next? That's massively important. So I'm excited to talk to Michael about that on tomorrow's edition of the show. We'll dive deeper into numbers and the roster and all those sorts of things. Hopefully by the end of our Tuesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, we'll have an answer for you. Who has more pressure on them, Ziaire or Jenkins? So make sure you tune in tomorrow to find out what DeMichael thinks. And of course, I'll give I kind of hinted there in my little preview, a little monologue, I suppose. I might talk myself out of it. You know that, right? You've watched Locked On Grizzlies before. You've heard the show. You've read my work, hopefully, at Bluff City Media or Grizzly Bear Blues before that. I can talk myself in and out of a lot of things. Let's all just be honest with one another. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Again, we are your team each and every day, back in the saddle with almost everyday shows. Starting today, we'll be back tomorrow. Rate, comment, like, subscribe, review, all those sorts of things wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. DeMichael will be back with me tomorrow. But until then, thank you for being here with me on this edition of the show. We will catch you later. Stay locked in. This is Locked On Grizzlies.